This is Significant Brothers, and I'm Chase.
I'm Brad.
And I'm Kray.
And today's episode is about alternative currencies. Currencies are used for transactions as a medium of exchange for a good or a service. But it wasn't always just George Washington on the dollar bill or Queen Victoria on the pound. No, there are a variety of different currencies that people have used over the course of time to make transactions.
Throughout time, national governments have ordained certain national currencies and have been in charge of coining and printing those currencies. But throughout time, there's also been an undersetting layer of different currencies, of alternative currencies that people would use to undermine the government. I'm just kidding.
Central banks have controlled currency for hundreds of years. Prior to that, societies have used alternative currencies as a way of standardizing their transactions and making a more efficient economy to generate more wealth and make more transactions. Alternative currencies can be anything from cacao, tea bricks, to even personal merit within a small society. Kray, do you have any sort of alternative currency that you'd like to talk about?
Yeah, usually there is the national currency. There's also other currencies that can work alongside it, kind of locational. So there are these currencies that coexist with national currencies, and I specifically looked in the United States and looked at all of our local currencies that we have. And if you actually go on Wikipedia, the United States has a lot of like currencies that belong to certain local areas that work alongside government's money, obviously, because we're not going back to the days of the Articles of Confederation of different currencies in different states.
So kind of like Chuck E. Cheese tokens.
Yes, like Chuck E. Cheese tokens. You can use those, but you can still use federal money. It's a good analogy. So between 1991 and 2004, there were 82 systems in the United States for local currencies, of which, or 20.7% of those currencies actually survive. Most of them last for a few years and then go into obscurity. One great example of this is actually in Holland. Holland, Michigan had a local currency called Holland dollars. And what happened is the Holland Chamber of Commerce in 2001 started working with a company out of Dayton, Ohio named Certifichex.
That's a terrible name.
Certifichex is kind of this company based out of Dayton, Ohio that works with like 20 other chambers in Michigan and 450 nationwide across the US. And what they do is kind of back up these currencies. They sell the certificates. I think it's backed by the chamber, so you know, it's meant to keep money in the local place because the money is useless elsewhere. It's supposed to help local business. I really haven't seen any empirical evidence to say it does do this. Because obviously, if this works super wonderfully, sanctions would be a great thing, but they're not.
So the Certifichex is essentially the Federal Reserve for what used to be Holland bucks, dollars.
Well, Certifichex is mainly a company that just kind of, yeah, I guess they make this money and they sell this money to people, and they kind of work with the chambers. But on one dark day, Certifichex closed up shop, most likely an attack from Ohio to dismantle our local economy. They ceased operations, and no one got their money.
Oh, wow.
Oh.
However, the Chamber of Commerce made good on the checks, even though Certifichex never gave them any of the money back. So people could still use them in local businesses, and then business owners would take it to the chamber, and they would be reimbursed. So really, Certifichex sold these, went bankrupt, so they didn't have to reimburse anything. and then the chamber just had to pay a bunch of money. They just lost a bunch of money for paying all these.
I feel like they had no stake in the certificate checks. Why would they back them up?
I don't know. They were an established company, but then they tanked, and it seemed to be working out.
It could have been so much worse if the chamber didn't decide to reimburse them.
Yeah, people will be pissed, because in the period of 2001 to 2009, they circulated $3 million worth of Holland dollars.
Wow.
So people actually use them.
Yeah, which is weird because I have never heard of them. It's unclear the economic implications of local currency, but it is kind of like a nice social factor, strengthening of neighborhood bonds, perhaps keeping money in the local economy, but you're also staving off strangers who would come into town and maybe not purchase because they didn't have Holland dollars. So there's that too. And I just have a few other local currencies. There are Ithaca Hours of Ithaca, New York. It used to be kind of in use. It's a bit inactive now because the creator of it moved out of town. So people just kind of stopped using it, mainly because debit and credit is much easier to use. And, and he moved out of town. But 1 hour was equal to $10, which is supposed to be used to pay someone for an hour's wage. So, I guess it depends though. It said it could be negotiated, which seems like a terrible currency.
Currencies should be that kind of thing, though. They're like, okay, it's worth exactly this much.
Exactly. It's like we all understand how much this is worth. They currently use Ithaca Cash.
Oh, they still use it now?
Yeah, they must have changed names or something when the owner left, so they can have someone else evangelize for this new currency. Because if no one's kind of trying to get it going, it's just going to fail. Because it's way more convenient to just use money by the federal government. That's just me, though. So those are just some local currencies in the United States that do or do not actually help the local economy.
Oh, guys, when you think of the Netherlands and you were to think of a specific flower, what flower would that be?
Tulips, of course.
Okay, so what if I told you that tulips are not, in fact, native to the Netherlands?
Say what?
Tell me more, Brad.
All right. The introduction of the tulip to Europe was by a man named Auger de Busbecq, and he sent the first tulip bulbs and seeds to Vienna in 1554. But from Vienna, the tulips went to other countries in Europe, including Amsterdam. And great thing is that tulips grew extraordinarily well in the Netherlands climate, specifically in the north. Tulips weren't necessarily used as so much of a currency, but they became so valuable at one point that they were often traded. Like, you could make trades with using these tulips. Back then, they had a currency called the florin, and now the average skilled craftsman made around 150 florins a year, and I think one florin has the purchasing power of around 10 to 11 euros currently. So 150, it's a fair amount of money. I'd say around 60 something thousand dollars a year.
Wait, 150 florins?
Wouldn't that be 1,500?
Which would be about, $1,500, but adjust for inflation.
I thought that was adjusted for inflation. I thought you said one florin was worth 10 euros.
10 euros in 2002 was the website I read it off of. We'll just say around $60,000. So that's what the average craftsman would make a year. And at the highest point in the tulip, well, they call it tulip mania, tulip bulb mania. It was the first what they would call a bubble. At the height of tulip mania, 40 bulbs sold for 100,000 florins. Yep, so if the average person makes 150 florins a year and 40 bulbs sold for 100,000 florins.
Wow.
That is a ton of money.
It's a lot of money. So early 1600s, the Amsterdam Stock Exchange opened up, and around 1633 that year, tulip bulbs became part of the stock exchange. You could put money into tulip bulbs. I don't know. It was really weird. And looking back, it's kind of a really strange thing because the only reason they were worth so much is because they were so rare at the time. And now we have a system of growing tulips it's really efficient. And
now, is it because they just did not grow it in farms? Because from what I understand, is that they only allowed them to grow in the dune area because that's the only area they thought they could grow. But then they found out they could plant them just like normal crops.
Events, I guess the collapse of the tulip bubble when it burst is because someone had an agreement to pay however much money for a couple of bulbs, and the person never ended up showing to make the payment, and people are like, oh no, these people they're fulfilling their deeds, it's going worthless, and people just started to panic and sell at lower rates. And then eventually it was at its height in February, and which is where the big purchase was made, and it got to its lowest in May, and that was it. The whole craze from opening up on the stock exchange started in November, December of 33, and then by May of 34, it was done. People weren't buying tulips anymore. Yeah, and apparently, I didn't know this, but like any big, like what could be seen as a bubble now, people think, oh, it's just another tulip mania. I've never heard that before, but people are calling like the new Bitcoin thing, oh, it's just another tulip mania. I've never heard that before.
Well, it's crazy. I guess they don't call it tulip mania for nothing. Another alternative currency.
I don't think people would have called, maybe tulips actually were a currency, but they sounded more like they were a commodity like gold.
There were several instances of where people would trade tulip bulbs for like properties and stuff like that because the value was so high. Like there was Charles Mackay, he did a whole thing on the tulip bulb, but someone had sold one bulb for 12 acres of land.
That makes sense if the value you think is going to go up. So yeah, what I think is funny about this whole thing is the whole point of tulips is, in my opinion, is to grow them. But it sounds like if you had a tulip bulb, you would have been very foolish to grow it. Because, actually, no, you wouldn't have been foolish to grow it, would you? Because it's not useless after that, because according to you, you could germinate the plant relatively easily and have more tulip bulbs off of that. Am I correct?
Yep, and then also, apparently, some forms, I think what we usually get are what would be the clones of the tulips, and then those only grow once, or something like that. But some of the bulbs, they can be used every year for like a number of years, and so when they're not growing, you can get up and move them and sell them. So basically, the smart thing to do is don't diversify all of your money into another non-currency and hope that it'll stay forever, because the grass withers and the flowers fade.
But national currencies are so much better.
That's why you should keep your money under your mattress. There is nothing better than just sipping on a nice cup of tea. But not everyone got to enjoy this luxury back in the day. In fact, it was a very sought-after luxury to be able to drink tea, because not every country had the means of which to grow tea. Because of trade routes, tea was shipped in the leaf form all over the world, near Central Asia and then up to Russia. It was incredibly inefficient just to transport the tea in the form of leaves. So what did they do? They made tea bricks.
What are tea bricks?
Tea bricks were these 8 by 10 by 1 inch thick dimension of compressed tea leaves that were used as a currency for a long time, up until around World War II, in countries such as China, Russia, and Central Asia, Tibet.
What were the value of like one tea brick, and let's say China? So how long did these exist?
It was like the mid-19th centuries where these started to become a major currency that was used. It's hard to get a gauge of how much it was worth because the worth was placed on the fermentation, the color, the weight, and the value of the wood leaf. So each brick was a little bit different as far as what kind of tea it was, but also the value is placed on how far the tea had traveled. Because if it came from China and it went all the way to the western side of Russia, it was going to be worth a lot more there than it would be in Tibet. The road that was traveled there made it a lot more valuable because of the strain that people had to go through to get the tea bricks over there.
Now, did people eventually use these tea bricks, or?
Yes, tea bricks were used for once they were traded, they were either used as another currency to trade, or in most communities, they were actually used right away. So people would trade stuff like horses, cows, what have you, for tea, and then the tea would be used right away. At one point in Russia, you could trade 12 bricks of tea for one horse. So think about how much money you trade for a horse nowadays, and kind of exchange that to a brick.
I have no concept of how much it takes to buy a horse. I understand one of my friends just got 2 horses for free, so I think that person just...
So basically 24 bricks of tea is worth nothing.
Yeah. Horses are worth nothing.
So how big were these bricks? Did you say that already?
8 by 10 by 1 inch. So I think 8 inches by 10 inches by 1 inch.
That's a lot of tea, especially if it's like compressed.
Yeah, like how dense is that?
Well, I don't know how dense it was, but it was packed down. But there were better forms of this tea. So like I said, there were different grades of it. That one of the values of it would be how far it traveled. The lowest grade of the tea was called Sinja, which meant wood tea. And like I said, the wood tea was part of what gave it its value, which meant how much wood was literally in the tea, because there were wood chips and twigs put in between that.
I feel like that's just like putting flour in a bag of cocaine.
or water in vodka.
Or sticks and tea bricks.
So it became such a prevalent thing that some people serve tea as a form of soup in Tibet, and you would find twigs and wood into your soup. It was very unappetizing.
Getting some nice earthy undertones here. It's like, yeah, Jim, it's because you're eating dirt.
So, but yeah, most of the tea bricks were sold to Russians and were widely used right away by the people in the country. The demand by the Russians drove the scarcity, and that's what pretty much forced it into a currency, was that people wanted it so bad, and it was just one thing. It wasn't like they had the option of coffee or orange juice or a bunch of other things. It was just tea or water. But one of the good things about tea bricks was if you did want to use it as currency, the price didn't fluctuate that much for the local area, because the tea bricks traveled from pretty much around the same area to pretty much around the same area. You're only going to be trading within maybe about 20 miles of where you live, so the price was going to be around the same as what you paid is what you're going to be charging another person. So that's why they were so widely accepted. But eventually factories came along in Russia that made, or that compressed, the tea leaves, and that's one of the downfalls of this. Is what's cool about currency, or what makes currency work, is there's a central bank. They say how much the money is worth, and banks set interest rates so that they can create money through loaning out money. You didn't have that with these factories. They just created essentially the currency, and there became so much of it that it was eventually worthless, because there wasn't as much scarcity then. So it's essentially the same thing where a bubble was burst and it wasn't worth anything. But during this is where it comes up to just pretty much until the end, is they were still widely used in Tibet until about World War II. Russia tried to buy all of the tea bricks around that time, because they were convinced, they tried to buy all the tea bricks in Tibet around that time because they were convinced that if they controlled the currency, they could then control the people. So hostile takeover in more than one way. They were used as much as they had to because tea was still is the most drank drink in the world besides water. So it was popular then, and people used it because they trusted it. But those tea factories are what ruined the currency and the demand for it.
So I feel like if there's one thing I've learned through all of this podcast is that just trust your local currency more than the other currencies because it'll probably work the best.
What? No, I feel like it's use the federal currency and don't use this other local currency.
That's what I meant. That is what I meant. I meant trust your federal currency.
They sure don't make currencies like they used to, but that's a good thing. Thanks for listening.